Hello, and welcome to Jam on History, the U.S. History Underground series that dives deep into the connection between American history and music. I'm your host, Mr. Zagari, and today we are exploring one of the most transformative years in rock music that shattered the status quo, bridged genres, and birthed some of the most iconic albums of all time. 1991. Up next on the U.S. History Underground. Similar to what you would hear on the U.S. History Underground podcasts, let's start with some context. The early 1990s were a pivotal time for music. The glam metal bands of the 80s, think Motley Crue and Poison, still dominated the charts. These groups embodied the economic excess of the 1980s and also had a sense of overproduction to be perfect. All they wanted to do was sell records. They lacked grit, passion, and authenticity within their music. The Cold War heated up in the early decade and began to thaw towards the end, with the yuppies, or young urban professionals, dominating the social scene. Commercialism and materialism was the norm. With the 80s coming to a close, the fissures in society were starting to emerge. Music listeners and television viewers craved something real, something raw. The Simpsons aired in 1989, and George H.W. Bush was trying to keep the conservative movement of Reagan alive. In a speech during his re-election campaign in 1992, he said, "American families need to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons." Furthermore, the First Lady, Barbara Bush, said The Simpsons was the dumbest thing she had ever seen. This is a clear sign of the culture wars on the horizon. The Simpsons reflected a much more authentic American experience than the sitcoms of the 80s and especially those of the 1950s. But society was changing, and the theme for the 90s was going to be a pushback against the conservative agenda of the 80s and a rejection of the glam and mainstream music of the decade as well. Sounds like the 60s, doesn't it? But this pushback is coming from the sons and daughters of the baby boomer hippies of the previous generation. The coming decade would see the rise of grunge, the redefining of alternative rock, which would become mainstream, and the blending of genres in ways society and the music industry had ever seen. What made 1991 a significant year for musical creativity in the early 90s? Well, this period coincided with the emergence of Generation X, which includes Zennials, a micro-generation born between 1977 and 1983. As these groups matured during the 90s, they carried the influences of their baby boomer parents but sought a deeper understanding beyond the main materialism and extravagance that characterized much of the 1980s. There was a growing discontent with consumer culture, leading audiences to desire music that felt more genuine and less commercial, echoing the sentiment of the 1960s counterculture movement. Moreover, the advent of MTV and advancements in recording technology marked the beginning of the digital music era. The demand for authentic, unrefined, and underground sounds paved the way for the contrasting ideas of alternative and mainstream music throughout 1991 and the subsequent decade. We will expand more on grunge and alternative in a bit, but let's talk about a few iconic albums that were released in 1991. It was a year packed with groundbreaking albums across the rock spectrum. Let's first start with hard rock, which is a bit more serious, authentic, and expressive than the glam metal we saw in the 80s, but still fits along with our theme of the underground becoming mainstream. Metallica's self-titled album, or the Black Album, brought metal to the mainstream with hits like Enter Sandman and The Unforgiven. An article from the Saturday Evening Post in 2021 reflecting on the impact of the Black Album stated the following: Metallica displayed a newfound consciousness on the part of the band, as well as through embrace of the video medium. Though some of the songs drifted into the 6-minute range, most were shorter and lent themselves to a radio and TV audience. Notable tracks like Sad But True and The Unforgiven found the band playing at a slower tempo. The almost ballad video was a major presence on MTV. This album found an entirely new wave of fans, resulting in 16 million copies sold in the United States alone. It's one of the most successful albums ever made and spent more than 550 weeks on the album charts. It was also the leading edge of a remarkable autumn for rock music in '91. kicking off a period that saw classic releases by Guns N' Roses, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Pixies, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers, which all arrived over a 2-month span. Metallica toured continuously on the back of the album through 1994, increasing their massive fan base and becoming one of the biggest bands in the world. In addition to Metallica's Black Album, the simultaneous release of Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion albums, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, surfaced in September of 1991, and it represented a pivotal moment in rock music history. These albums highlighted the band's transition from their raw and rebellious beginnings to a more ambitious and varied sound. They skillfully merged hard rock with ballads, orchestral elements, and blues influences. Although the Black Album propelled Metallica into mainstream success, the Use Your Illusion album solidified Guns N' Roses' status as one of the most commercially successful bands of the era, debuting at both number 1 and number 2 positions on the Billboard charts. With their immense commercial success, Guns N' Roses and Metallica would join forces to co-headline a tour that would become a historic milestone in rock music, merging two of the most prominent bands at the time, uniting hard rock and heavy metal fans on an unmatched scale. The tour highlighted the intense energy and cultural significance of both groups, attracting large audiences and solidifying their legacies. Despite facing logistical hurdles and sporadic controversies, such as a riot in Montreal, this collaboration represented the zenith of rock's mainstream popularity in the early 90s and left a lasting impact on the concert industry with its spectacle. Additionally, this tour signified a crucial turning point just before the emergence of grunge, which transformed the rock music scene. In addition to hard rock, we see fusion among genres. U2 reinvented themselves with Achtung Baby, blending rock with electronic influences. Then there was R.E.M's Out of Time, featuring the hit single Losing My Religion, a song that brought alternative rock into countless living rooms, getting it started on the college radio scene of the time. And let's not forget one of my favorites, the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magic, an album that fused funk, rock, and introspection in ways few bands had ever attempted. Probably the most important part of discussing 1991 in our podcast was the impact it had on culture. Grunge takes center stage in this discussion. The iconic albums that were released in the year didn't just top the charts, they changed American culture. American culture was moving away from the Waltons and resembling the family dynamic of The Simpsons. Grunge and alternative music remained at the center stage for the decade. The glitz and glamour of the rock star gave way to the flannel, humility, and authenticity of the grunge movement. 1991 was the year this underground Seattle sound exploded onto the global stage. Well, what's the turning point, you ask? It has to be Nirvana's Nevermind. Released in September, it dethroned Michael Jackson's Dangerous on the Billboard 200, proving that rock wasn't just alive, it was evolving. Smells Like Teen Spirit became an anthem for disaffected youth, but Nirvana wasn't alone. Pearl Jam dropped 10, a record that combined grunge's grit with heartfelt melodies. And let's not forget about Soundgarden's Bad Motor Finger and Alice in Chains' Facelift, albums that solidified the grunge movement. Although I personally think Alice in Chains brings more of a hard rock element than the so-called grunge, they are from Seattle and express the authenticity of the movement. Suddenly, flannel shirts and distorted guitars were everywhere in America. Let's look at two albums and tracks closely, Nirvana's Nevermind and Pearl Jam's 10. While being iconic as per Billboard, they also reflected the social, political, and economic angst of the period. Chris Novoselic, the bass player for Nirvana, gave an interview and metaphorically described what grunge was. He indicated that the Pacific Northwest has a lot of trees, and from trees we get logs. To get the logs, we need to cut down the trees. Many people's lives were like the trees and were cut down due to the economic climate of the region. This take on the movement is a prime example of how teens and young adults were in a deep cycle of debt and drugs and felt that they had no way out. Music of the time became a safety valve to release this pent-up energy. In addition, Eddie Vedder, the frontman from Pearl Jam, read an article about Jeremy Wade Dell, a sophomore in Texas who shot himself in front of his English class and wrote the song Jeremy. Included with the single, Pearl Jam released a music video on MTV that put visual to this tragedy and showed the nation an authentic representation of teen troubles at the time. This is a far cry from the glitz and limousines and clubs and rock and roll antics of the 1980s. These were real-life dramas that these artists and nation were facing. The facade of economic prosperity was closing quickly, and those ideals of an idyllic America were also fading. The grunge movement intertwined social, political, and economic issues with flannel shirts and heavy distortion, while alternative music began to gain mainstream popularity. The idea of mainstream music being labeled as alternative is a recurring theme in the history of American music. Consider Bob Dylan, the iconic folk singer of the 60s who brought traditional folk into the limelight. He faced significant backlash when he electrified his sounds during his performance of Like a Rolling Stone at the Newport Jazz Festival. Similarly, grunge and alternative rock experienced resistance from their devoted fans. Kurt Cobain was reluctant to abandon his underground punk origins, yet he felt compelled to adapt to more of a mainstream sound just to survive. In an essay posted by Teach Rock, they argue that Nevermind features a melodic and emotionally expansive direction. Nirvana had the roots of punk, with keeping the albums authentic and unpolished, but the adaptation of survival by having melodic melodies and lyrics. Well, what does this all mean? What it means is that the groove and the lyrics of the songs were catchy and easy to palate for mainstream radio and MTV. It's all about the money, folks. Both Dylan and Cobain were trailblazers. They stood out within a movement that itself was countercultural, reshaping music and their respective decades. When Dylan introduced electric instrumentations at Newport in 1965, rock music took a new turn, merging elements of folk, classic rock, and country. Nirvana's release of Nevermind brought the underground scene into the mainstream, transforming rock music and giving rise to several subgenres, particularly after Cobain's tragic suicide in 1994. Despite their differing musical backgrounds, Dylan and Cobain shared a significant commonality: authenticity. Each artist captured the essence of the American culture during their times, with Dylan exploring the depths of the civil rights movement and Vietnam War. Cobain addressed issues like depression, substance abuse, and teenage suicide that affected many communities across the nation. During this time, alternative music was evolving alongside grunge, with the two often being referred to interchangeably as they shared crossover elements. This genre blending demonstrated to the music industry that taking risks with different styles could lead to success. Groups such as the Smashing Pumpkins and Jane's Addiction built upon this groundwork, crafting sounds that were difficult to categorize. As a result, many subgenres began to appear after '94, as previously said, including this post-grunge, pop-punk, nu metal, etc. Additionally, we cannot overlook the visual aspect, as MTV's frequent airing of these artists made music videos a crucial element of the storytelling of rock music. Hip-hop played a crucial part in this dialogue as well. Hip-hop, especially gangster rap and grunge, while differing in sound, shared remarkably similar principles centered on genuine expression and critiques of society. Both genres rose as formidable platforms for marginalized and disenchanted groups during the late 20th century. Gangsta rap, represented by artists like NWA, Snoop Dogg, and Dr. Dre, illustrated the brutal truths of urban existence, systemic oppression, and social inequality. In contrast, grunge, spearheaded by bands such as Nirvana, conveyed feelings of isolationism, disappointment, and defiance against societal expectations. Both movements turned away from the commercial refinement, focusing instead on an unfiltered realism, and provided their listeners with a sense of identity and empowerment through candid narratives. Collectively, they transformed cultural landscapes by questioning mainstream stories and elevating rebellious voices. So, what is the legacy of the year? 1991 is often regarded as one of the most iconic and transformative years in music history. It marked the release of a staggering number of influential albums across various genres, shaping the music industry and cultural landscape for years to come. For alternative and grunge, 1991 saw the mainstream breakthrough, particularly through the Seattle music scene. This marked a shift from the polished glam metal of the 80s to raw, introspective, and heavier sounds. Metal and hard rock became more mainstream, and bands began experimenting with sounds and capitalizing on the MTV revolution that began in the 80s, which became the quote algorithm for music in the 1990s. Well, that's all for us today. Be sure to use this YouTube channel for its content spotlights, unit reviews, A Push on the Road segments, Jam on History, and other spectacular podcasts. Keep on keeping on.